Welcome aboard. John McGinness with you, News Radio KFBK. Also very, very happy to have in studio a man who is taking a bold step. He is a Republican. He's conservative. He's a law and order guy. He happens to be a very, very recently retired member of the Superior Court of the state of California and for the county of El Dorado. His name is Steve Bailey, and he's in studio with me now. And he's also, oh yeah, by the way, did I neglect to mention, a candidate for Attorney General of the state of California. Your Honor, welcome to the conversation. Glad to have you.
Thank you. Honored to be here.
This is a bold step, and every day I lament the course of action in which our state has endeavored in recent years, and the absolute, I think, evisceration of the criminal justice system, which has a kind of a delayed effect in terms of when people start to really truly discern what has happened. My fear is that will really truly settle in when you have that many more people who will feel the impact, the adverse impact of some of the things that have been done through the executive and legislative branches of government in the state of California. So how are you going to fix all that? Just that's all. But let's kind of look at Propositions 47 and 57 and maybe AB 109 a little bit and get your thoughts there. I know this is these are products of the legislature and the voters, not so much the judiciary. But how does your effort and your experience from the bench, how does that fit into all of this?
Yeah, I served eight and a half years as a Superior Court judge. And during that period of time, I started to see exactly the same people coming back on the same types of crimes time and time again. You'd sentence them to prison, and the governor would figure out a way to release them back into the community. And the worst part about it is that those people were back in the community preying upon people who then ended up becoming part of the victims in the state. And it was incredible. I couldn't believe that we would run a criminal justice system in this state that was that had become so totally bankrupt that we were releasing up to 40,000 inmates out of the state prison with no supervision right back onto the streets to prey upon, basically, people who are defenseless towards these people. In this state, we've taken every step that we can to punish law-abiding citizens and to reward people who are in the business of committing crimes. And that's not only unfortunate, but it's got to stop.
And when you think about the impact, these are, by the way, there's so much opportunity along the way. I always like to throw out the statistic. I believe that it's still current. Just in one jail in Sacramento County alone, the main jail, there are about 60,000 people booked a year. Actually, more accurately, 60,000 times people are booked. But of those arrests, the prosecutor has to look and decide and triage and decide who is really worthy of going to trial, who's going to be convicted of their criminality. So there's a first triage there. Actually, it begins before that. As the evidence is collected, not everybody who appears to be guilty, who the investigating person believes very, very solidly is guilty, represents sufficient evidence to bring the matter for prosecution and trial. And then the jury and the court has say as to what happens. So these are people who have worked their way through all of that and find themselves in a position where the best remedy to safeguard society from them is to incarcerate them. Notwithstanding all of that, they're still released at an alarming rate.
Well, under AB 109, Prop 57, we're rewarding these people for the crimes that they've committed. We can't do that. I mean, psychologists have taught us that if there's no consequence, human nature doesn't change. And we as judges, we took a sacred oath to the people of California to protect them, not from the perspective of throwing everyone in prison the first time they commit a crime. I mean, you've got to work your way to state prison. And for the governor and this attorney general and the previous administration to be releasing these people back onto the street, and frankly, without supervising them, is a travesty.
Yeah, during the course of my career, there was a time when somebody was on parole, and you would find them, oftentimes there were a list of specific limitations on their freedom. In other words, they're subject to incarceration, but they're going to be allowed out in order to give them a chance to learn to behave and assimilate in society. But they have prohibited association. They can't have any alcohol in their blood. They can't be in possession of any kind of a weapon. Liberties that others have that they don't because of their status. that was a fairly decent tool to be able to cause their parole officer to sanction them, to violate the terms of their parole and put them back in custody. That non-revocable parole is largely gone now, so it requires, I mean, they surrender their 4th and 14th Amendment rights, but it requires that they be subject to a whole new prosecution, which is a burden on the system when they've already been in. And the foreseeability, the predictability of what they're capable of doing, if allowed to be free again, is very clear.
Yeah.
So
we've almost totally gutted the process of parole
Yeah.
in the state. To send them back in front of a judge, which is what we do now, to essentially adjudicate a parole violation when, that might take 3 or 4 months and they end up on a time served basis. Frankly, the way we used to do it, there was an immediate consequence for violating that gift that we had given them when we released them from custody. There's no immediate consequence any longer. And if you're not going to do that, then it encourages these people to go back, commit new crimes, and who are they preying upon? They're preying upon you and me, people in low-income neighborhoods, where they're preying upon our kids and our grandkids.
Absolutely.
And as Attorney General, I'm going to see that changes.
There's a time during my career when I was investigating crimes, actively investigating crimes, and 3 strikes. I worked to get 3 strikes and you're out pass. I was a part of that effort, and we actually saw people who had been in the system, and they would have subsequent encounters with the law, perhaps as a witness, perhaps as a percipient, maybe somebody who could be on the edges of that, but they knew how to tally their strike status better than we did in terms of the detectives investigating their cases. They were on top of it. So it tells me that they did understand the magnitude of that, and that they did modify their behavior to some degree. Now, when the change in parole came, known as NRP, non-revocable parole, that's what the system calls it. That's what CDCR calls it. But the cons themselves call it NRP, not really on parole, because they're not, because they're simply not. So those specific prohibitions against them are largely gone, and then the ability to reincarcerate them, to subject them to a kind of a timeout if you use very rudimentary, elementary kind of consequences for bad behavior, those days are gone. And I'm afraid the consequences of that have been dramatic and really painful for people in a way that shouldn't have had to happen. So, but I got to ask you, this is a blue state. This is a state in which tidbits of information get disseminated through, frankly, a largely sympathetic media to a certain ideology. You got an enormous battle ahead of you. How are you going to get to the people?
Yeah, I mean, that is an excellent question. But the reality is public safety isn't a Republican or a Democrat issue. It's not an issue common only to independents. It affects each and every one of us, and it affects all the socioeconomic levels, whether you're rich or poor. And quite frankly, the people who are preyed upon by criminals more often than not are poor in our neighborhoods. And they want a law officer to, take a tough approach to criminals. Get them off the streets. Get them out of the neighborhoods. They don't want the drug dealers and the pimps on their street.
Right.
And that's what our Attorney General needs to focus on. All too often, what's happening now is that they're all focused on what's going on in Washington, D.C. or some other place rather than what's happening in Sacramento or in Rockland or, in Oak Park.
Right.
If you don't have an Attorney General that's really tied down and focused on what's happening here in California, nothing's going to happen in California, and things are going to continue to get out of control. Doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that if you release all these people onto the street, that our crime rate's going to go up in this state.
With what I would offer is a profound incentive to reoffend, because the consequences aren't going to be there. And I think back in my own life, I was reared in an environment where I was bound. I mean, I had to deal with strict educators, the presence of law enforcement, and I'm not sure how my life would have gone if I didn't have that immediate consequence of misconduct. And I think that's a disservice to those who don't experience it now. And there's a foreseeability. If you let them get away with it once, twice, 3 times, their aberrant behavior is going to get worse. It's going to escalate, and we all suffer. Even they suffer from it. So, more questions before we got to take care of some other business, pay some bills. The Honorable Stephen Bailey with us, candidate for Attorney General of the state of California. Much more conversation right after this. Don't go away.
It is time for action.
News when you need it.
Spin out into the center, divide its block.
Thanks for staying on board. John McGinness with you, News Radio KFDK. Also in the studio is the Honorable Stephen Bailey, candidate for Attorney General of the state of California. And you're talking about the political landscape in which you're running. I do really, truly believe that it's important to note that, as you say, criminal issues transcend all economic, racial, societal divides. It really, truly does. And I think, to a great extent, there's a kind of a regressive attitude or tendency in criminality because there's so much more, obviously more dense population in the inner cities where dollars are more scarce and people are suffering and working harder to climb out of a bad lifestyle, and therefore they're more likely to be victimized. And then as I look at the system's failure to really address the misconduct of some people, you think about who suffers from that. Clearly the victims and the insurance companies and all that, but those people who are first stepping outside the bounds of acceptable behavior and don't feel an adverse impact for that, what's the foreseeability? They're gonna continue, and it actually compromises their quality of life, I believe.
I agree with you completely. And, what ends up happening is that they commit the first crime, they commit the next crime.
Yeah.
And usually what we saw anecdotally is that it got worse.
Yeah.
It didn't get better. They didn't go commit a lesser crime.
Right.
They went out, if they could get away with it once, they went out and tried a theft, tried a burglary, tried a robbery. And that didn't happen with everyone. I don't want to, a broad brush here, but the likelihood of a person progressing up the system and becoming out of control, unable to live within our societal bounds, became worse and worse as we let people go.
Well, we talked a little bit off air about the idea of this revolving door and how we could do better, how the state of California could do better, and we like to think of ourselves as this, innovative, progressive environment. But you look at the state of California; they seem to do a better job of controlling recidivism. They actually closed jails and prisons in Texas. Yeah,
in Texas.
Not because they can't afford to keep them open, but because the need is gone. So, what could we do? What could we learn from Texas? Do you suppose?
Well, I think we can learn a lot from it. None of us would ever confuse Texas as a progressive mecca. Right. But what Texas has done, they've recognized that drugs and mental health are critical issues. And they, as opposed to building a big prison to put more people in Texas, they took that money and put it into their mental health system. California needs to start looking at that. When we closed the mental health or the mental hospitals in the 1970s, what we didn't do in California is provide a system in the communities to address mental health problems. And one of the things California needs to do to really be able to address the criminal issue and public safety issue is address mental health needs. And frankly, that isn't necessarily a direct issue that the Attorney General deals with, but it's one that the Attorney General needs to deal with if we're going to ever deal with the recidivism in our criminal population.
There's also the component of a bully pulpit within the office, a constitutional office, statewide standing and stature. It seems the ability maybe the obligation to seize that opportunity and persuade the system to go in the right direction is really a part of it. So, as you work your way further into your goals, you have my support. I encourage you, and I'll be happy to work with you and get your message out. You're welcome back on this program. I'll also extend the same invitation to Mr. Becerra. And as I disclosed to the audience before you arrived, he's a charming, affable sort of fellow. But what has he done in terms of substance for the criminal justice system in the state of California? I'm not saying it. And I think he's overtly political, overtly partisan. And the future, I fear, would be better they'll be enhanced if we have somebody who really truly takes it as a prosecutorial role. The Honorable Stephen Bailey, thank you so much for being here, sir.
Thank you.
And I wish you all the best.
And thank you for your support.
You bet. And that's it for me, as you can tell by the sound of the music, but stick around because the lovely and talented Kitty O'Neill's coming up next with the afternoon news. I will see you tomorrow. Have a great one. So long.